everybody, welcome back to Sip and Sell. My name is Paul. Today we're going to be talking about the whiskey basics. So what is whiskey? How does whiskey get its name? How does whiskey get its flavour? Different casks, different regions, all that stuff we're going to go into in this video. So I think the first question we need to ask is, what is whiskey? And that's pretty easy. Whiskey is just grain spirit aged in at least 40% alcohol. And that is it. That's the most simple definition of whiskey. So that really shows you how simple whiskey is. Now, whiskey is just a generic naming word, like the word cake. With cake, you have different types of cake, like chocolate cake, vanilla cake, red velvet, that sort of thing. Whiskey is the exact same thing. We have different types of whiskey. So single malt, blended malt, grain, bourbon, the list goes on. So then, how did whiskey get its name? So whiskey gets its name from the Old Scotch Gaelic Uisce Beatha. Uisce Beatha means water of life. That was shortened to Uisce and then translated to whiskey. So that's how whiskey got its name. So now we know what whiskey is and why whiskey is called whiskey, but how do we know what a single malt or a bourbon or a grain whiskey actually is? And how does it get that name? Now, whiskey can be made anywhere in the world, but the most popular places to make whiskey are Scotland, Japan, Canada, USA and Ireland. Whiskey is also made of 4 cereals or grains. These are usually barley, corn, rye or wheat. All these factors influence whether a whiskey will be called a bourbon, a grain whiskey or a single malt. Now, a popular discussion point around whiskey is the way that whiskey is spelled. So for example, is it spelled with or without an E? Now generally, whiskey is spelled without an E in Scotland, Canada and Japan, but with an E in places like the USA and Ireland. So how do we know if a whiskey can be called a single malt, a bourbon or a blended whiskey? Well, I've made a small table for you to look at which breaks down the name, so for example single malt, the ingredients that would make the single malt, and an example of what a single malt is. So a single malt is just malted barley spirit from one distillery. Only barley grain can be used. An example of a single malt is Glenfiddich 12-year-old. That's a very popular single malt in bars and I'm sure that you would have heard of it. A blended malt is described as a blend of 2 or more single malts from different distilleries. For example, Monkey Shoulder. Now, I did a tasting of Monkey Shoulder in my last video, and in that tasting I said that Monkey Shoulder was a mixture of single malts from Balvenie, Glenfiddich and Kinninvie. We then move on to bourbon whiskey and rye whiskey. Now these two are quite similar. Bourbon whiskey is whiskey made from at least 51% corn. The other 49% can be made of other grains. Rye is whiskey made from at least 51% rye. The 49% can be made from other grains. 2 examples of good bourbon and rye whiskey are from Bulleit. A single grain whiskey is a whiskey made from a mixture of grains, for example barley and corn, from one single distillery. A blended grain whiskey is a whiskey made from a mixture of grains from 2 or more distilleries. An example of a blended grain is Haig Club, the one with David Beckham. The last but not least is blended whiskey. Now this is generally the cheapest kind of whiskey, and it's made from any mixture of grains from any number of distilleries. Examples of this are Famous Grouse or Grant's. So now we know all about the naming of whiskey. How does whiskey actually get its flavour? Now whiskey can get its flavour in a number of ways. Firstly, the whiskey may be peated. Now peated is the smoky flavour you get from whiskey when the barley was dried using peat. So secondly, whiskey gets its flavour from its maturation. This may be from the type of barrel, for example bourbon or sherry, and the length of time it was in that barrel. Region or country can also influence the flavour of the whiskey. For the remainder of the video, I'm more going to focus on how the Scots use their different regions to flavour their whiskey. but I will do another video on how different countries flavour their own whisky. Now there are 6 different Scotch whisky regions, and each of these regions has its own influence on the flavour of whisky. The most popular one might be Islay, which is more peaty. Secondly, Speyside generally use a lot of sherry cask, so their whisky might be sweeter. However, not one flavour profile sticks with one region, so you can get peated whisky all over Scotland and sherried whisky all over Scotland too. Now the biggest influence on whisky flavour is the type of cask that's used. Distilleries make new make spirit and transfer that into old casks that may have been used to make sherry or bourbon. Once left for a number of years, this is what gives whisky the flavour. So a popular cask to flavour whisky is bourbon casks. Now obviously the previous liquid in this cask was bourbon whisky, and it gives it a vanilla, sweet and cake flavour and the colour influence of gold. Another popular whisky cask is sherry. Now this can be split into 2 different types of sherry. Firstly, Oloroso. Oloroso usually gives the whisky a dried fruit, spice and cherry flavour, and it usually turns the whisky red. The second type of sherry is Pedro Jimenez sherry. Now that is usually a sweeter sherry and gives the whisky a jam, very sweet, almost syrupy flavour, and tints the whisky deep red. Port is also a popular cask to use. Port is a fortified wine and usually turns the whisky spicy, gives it another dried fruit flavour, and it's also sweet. Similar to sherry, it also turns the whisky slightly red. Lastly, rum casks are being used more and more to flavour whisky. Now rum gives the whisky a sweet syrup, vanilla and caramel flavour and tints the whisky golden and amber. Now this list is not extensive and there's many different types of casks that can be used to flavour whisky. These are just some of the more popular ones. Now when you taste whisky, it's important to know what type of flavour profiles you're actually tasting. So I've made another small table for you to look at in your own time. I'm not going to go through this, it's not an extensive list. This is just a simple sort of chart to help you differentiate some flavours when you're tasting your whiskies. Feel free to screenshot it and use it in the meantime. So folks, that's us finished. I hope you've learned a little bit more about whisky with the name, where it comes from, different flavours and profiles. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon.